Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the Behind the Frame series. It's actually the first time that I'll be assisting Andrew with the Behind the Frame, and I'm really looking forward to sharing a really exciting image that I took recently on a Best of Botswana safari, and just generally to be more involved in what I believe to be a really cool initiative from Andrew to set up the Behind the Frame series to give you an insight into how we edit images and basically how we enhance an image that's been taken in camera to, in my opinion, get it to the point where it is as similar as it was to what your eye had seen as possible. In my opinion, when it comes to wildlife photography, I think it's very easy to over-edit an image, and that kind of goes down the avenue of changing rather than enhancing an image. So your eye, in my opinion, is always able to capture something much better than what your camera can, and provided you've captured it correctly in camera with the right settings, it's always going to require a certain element of enhancing post-processing wise to ensure that the image is as close to what you had seen with your eye as possible, but there's a very fine line between changing and enhancing an image. So, but this Behind the Frame series is all about how to enhance an image and how to really maximize on the photograph or photographs that you may have taken. So with that being said, let's just dive straight into it, and I'll take you through one of the photographs that I captured. So basically, just to take you to the beginning of where the sighting all started, this was in the Khwai region of Botswana, and the one particular morning, it's a very vast open landscape. We stopped the vehicle because we thought we'd heard something, and all the guests got their binoculars out and we started scanning into the distance. And that is where we saw one of these male lion heads pop up in the distance. And then we kind of raced around thinking that we were only going to get there to see one male lion, and we saw two males and two females, and they kind of interacted with each other. In fact, there was quite a strange interaction between a lot of these lions on that particular morning for whatever reason. And as I kind of scroll through and take you through some of these, you'll start to see how a male starts to track or follow this female into an open area, and very quickly that interaction became quite aggressive. And so this is the image that I want to take you through. This is one that has already been edited, and it's one that I've posted on Instagram already, and I'd like to take you through this from start to finish from an enhancing or post-processing perspective to show you how I got from this, which will be the original shot, to the shot that has already been edited and posted online. It's not a hell of a lot in terms of post-processing, but there are some technical details that I'd like to take you through that would help you if you were to sort of edit a shot of this kind. So everyone, first and foremost, has their own way of editing, has their own way of using a Lightroom flow, and that's of course to be respected. But there are some basic things that everyone should apply when looking at an image. So let's go straight into the editing side of things. First things first, I like to apply or enable any profile corrections for the lens that I was using. In this case, it was a 300mm 2.8 lens with a 1.4 times converter, and that took me to about 420 mils at f4. And so I like to remove the profile corrections, and basically all you can see there is that it just sort of flattens the image out a little bit and removes any natural vignetting of that particular lens profile, and basically that allows me to start from a clean canvas. And the second thing that I like to do before actually getting into the details of any editing is to go and crop. In this case, it lends itself quite nicely to a 16:9 aspect ratio crop, basically just because I want to accentuate the action that exists between the lioness and the male. Yes, there's nice dark background to play with over here, but I don't want that to overshadow what's really happening in the foreground. So what I'm going to do is take that down to a 16:9 crop and pull that down to the ground so that I'm including enough foreground leading up towards my subjects. And I may have cut off quite a bit of that background, but there's still enough there for me to work with. And then what I'm going to do is pull in from the top left-hand corner just a little bit tighter, so there's not too much negative space in this frame. I don't want it too tight. I want there to be space on either end of the tails of these lines, and kind of have them center frame. And that obviously goes against the rule of thirds, which is why I don't necessarily like it being called a rule. Excuse me. But basically to have them center frame, because the action is the center part of this image, and to have that off to one side, either upwards or downwards, would kind of lose that effect. You want this this image to really be striking. And in order for that to be achieved, you would need to have this action dead center of the frame. So that's what I've done, gone to a 16:9 crop, pulled it in a little bit from the top left-hand corner, and still left enough in the foreground and in the background to work with at a later stage. So go ahead and hit done. The next thing, and why I say it's really important in terms of post-processing, is looking at the settings. And in this particular case, it was early morning. There was some golden backlit sunlight that was coming through, which really helped the situation. And this is also where predictive guiding comes in. Between myself and the local Botswanan guide, we had kind of an understanding that this interaction was on the cards and that it could potentially happen. So we prepared the guests in time, and the local guide positioned the vehicle, and I made sure that the guests had a number of things in place. The first and foremost, and the most important aspect of wildlife photography, particularly when there's lots of action like this, is to ensure that you have a fast enough shutter speed. And that would kind of be anything over around 1,000th of a second. And in this case, 1/1,250 was more than enough. And the second thing then to worry about is the depth of field. There are two subjects at play here. They're both coming in from different angles of the frame, and they're meeting at a midpoint. But if I was to shoot this at 2.8 or f4, the kind of room for error in terms of the depth of field might have meant that an aspect of the frame might have been sharp and in focus and another aspect out of focus. And you just don't want to leave yourself that room for error when you're working with such tight margins. So in this case, I went from f4, which is the minimum I could go with a teleconverter, up to 7.1. And that just allows more of room for error in terms of the depth of field. And I really wanted both of my subjects, when they came together, to be as sharp as possible. Not for one of them to be sharp and the other out of focus. So it was really important to make these adjustments quite quickly to ensure that, one, I had good depth of field, and two, that my shutter speed was fast enough. And that meant that I underexposed, I think in this case by 2/3 under, and lifted my ISO from original 200 to 500. And the combination then of exposure compensation and ISO adjustment meant that I achieved a shutter speed of around 1.250 at an aperture that I was comfortable would give me more room for error in terms of the depth of field. So that's basically how we decided on the settings, and once we had those dialed in, we knew that whatever action was going to come our way, we were good to go. Okay, so now basically what I do in terms of my Lightroom workflow is to start from the global adjustments, from the basic panel all the way down, and then go and make any localized adjustments that might be necessary for this particular frame. Some things that stand out to me before I even start editing is that I would like to maintain the dark background. There's really good contrast between the sunlit early morning grass versus that dark background. I may even accentuate that dark background at a later stage. The other thing for me is that there's quite a lot of shadow on both of the lines, in fact, because they are backlit by the rising sun in the east. And so I'd like to lift those shadows off the lines' faces in particular, particularly the male line, where a lot of the detail around his mouth, his nose, and his eyes has been lost in the shadows, and a lot of detail lost in the darkness of his mane. So I'd like to, at a later stage, with some global adjustments, but also with some specific brushing at a later stage, to try and pull those shadows to illuminate a bit more detail. And that's pretty much all I would do here. So let's dive right into it, and I'll take you through some of the settings. First things first, from a white balance perspective, I want to try and warm this image up just a little bit. Not too much where it starts to look really fake, which is quite easy to do when it comes to white balance. You don't want to take it that far. I really want to take it to a point where it's just a little bit warmer than what it was captured in camera, because ultimately I want to try and accentuate that early morning sun, and especially that rim lighting that you're getting on the top of his mane and on the outskirts of this female, which at a cooler white balance weren't as prominent as what they would be slightly warmer. So that's what I've done. I've lifted the white balance from a temperature perspective to make it slightly more warm, and once again to accentuate those areas of the frame as a result of the backlighting. I then want to take my exposure, which is currently at a neutral point, and actually drop it by about sort of 10 points or so. One, to maintain that dark background, and two, because it's going to further accentuate a lot of that rim lighting that you're seeing both in the foreground, in the grass, in a lot of the dust that you see here, and on the outskirts of both of the lines. And rather than keeping that at neutral, I'd like to try and darken those areas, which I will do at a later stage and come fix those shadowed areas. I'm going to be lifting the highlights a little bit. One, because there's some highlights here in the foreground that I want to make sure that are included in part of the frame. And there's some highlighted areas around this lioness that are currently quite dull as a result of her being backlit. So I'm not going to be too aggressive. A lot of these adjustments that I make here in the basic panel are actually pretty incremental. And as I said, the first things that I noticed were shadow. So I'm really going to want to lift those shadows up, not a hell of a lot, but just enough for there to be a difference in the frame. I want to lift some of the whites because looking at my histogram, I've still got a bit of space to go in terms of the whites. I'm going to lift those somewhat, and you're going to start to see some of the areas in the frame that are popping as a result of the white adjustments, once again in the foreground and on the female's face. And there's quite a lot of dark in this frame, particularly in the foreground, which I want to lift just a tad as well. Once again, watching my histogram on the far left-hand side. I then might go and add a touch of clarity. I'm very nervous about adding too much clarity at a global level. I'd rather brush it at a specific local level. And the other thing then, vibrance as opposed to saturation is a more gentle color adjustment across the tonal range of the frame. And so I'm going to lift that to around about 20, to the point where a lot of these vibrant colors stand out and pop a lot more than they would previously. The adjustments in terms of whites and blacks on a global level, I've dialed back somewhat, about 5 to 10% in the basic panel, on the basis that I'm then going to go and make further adjustments in the tone curve, which affect different areas of shadows, highlights, and darks in the frame. And once again, I'm going to lift those highlights a little bit, lift some of the lights. I'm also looking at both the tone curve, the histogram, and the image while I'm doing it. I think it's really important to watch the image as opposed to just watching the sliders. Lift the darks a little as well. These adjustments I'm making here can be quite, there we go, just to 10 points. They're quite sensitive, so I'd rather make incremental adjustments both to the basic and to the tone curve area to ensure that I've achieved what I wanted to achieve rather than being too aggressive on one slider over another. I'm then going to come down to the detail panel and take sharpening up by a little bit. Basically over here I'm checking one of the outskirts, an area of contrast between the dark main and the light background, and at that particular point just making sure that where it was down at around 40 up to where it is now around about 75-80, I've added some extra sharpening on those edges, which is important, especially when you start to look at the backlight area of that main. And then by holding Option or Alt, I'm going to then ensure that masking is sharpening the right areas of the frame that I want. It's kind of a fine balance between sharpening the foreground, your subjects, and isolating them from the background, but you can do it too much to the point where you're not sharpening them enough. So I'm going to pull that back a little bit to a point where I'm happy at sharpening enough of the foreground, enough of my subjects, without too much of the background, and I think that's probably somewhere around there, which I'm now comfortable with. And on the basis that we've already made lens corrections and removed the natural vignetting of the lens, I then might go into the effects panel and start adding a very slight vignette from the outer edges of this frame to pull you into where the action is happening, and that's in the middle of the frame, which is exactly why I wanted to crop it to a 16:9 and move it into the center, and that's only further accentuated by the fact that I'm now adding a light vignette. And already, if you were to look at the before and after, that's quite a major adjustment, really just by doing some quite basic adjustments across the global panels. If you start to look at the overall color and white balance, that really pops a hell of a lot more just by changing the temperature. We've removed a lot of the shadows off the face, if you can see there, off the male in particular, but off the female's body as well. Look how she really stands out against that now truly golden background as opposed to the kind of dull shadowed area that she was in originally. There's a lot more detail in the foreground in terms of the color. A lot of this dust that's being kicked up by them fighting with each other is now more backlit than it was previously, and the background is a little bit less harsh than it was before. If you look at the golden rim lighting on the top of his mane, far more apparent than it was in the original image, and likewise for the female as well. So I've made really small incremental adjustments across the global panel, and that has already improved the image by quite some distance. So one thing to keep in mind is that a lot of people might make adjustments to the basic panel only and be quite aggressive with a lot of their sliders instead of addressing a lot more of these drop-down menus to ensure that you're making a more gradual approach across the whole image. And the result already is quite striking. But there's still more work to be done, and that is when I then go and look at the specialized or localized adjustment brush. And I'm going to double click on effect to ensure that all my values are zeroed. I want to choose the size of the feather, and I always like to show my selected mask overlay to see exactly where I'm brushing. And I want to start by just lightly brushing over the female, and the male will come a little later. But for me, she's still kind of overshadowed because she's backlit. She's a little dark over some of these areas. So I'm not going to be too pedantic about brushing within the lines and getting as much as possible. I just want to cover as much of her surface area as possible. And then where I really want to be more specific is on the male, not so much on his body. Just kind of brush over that lightly. Let's make that a bit bigger. Brush over the male's body pretty lightly. And then I really wanted to get into the detail of his face and his mane. I'm going to take a little bit more time to get that right, particularly on the outskirts, where we're going to be adding a touch of clarity in a second. Outskirts of his mane onto his face, making sure you're covering all of these areas so that it doesn't look out of place when you make the adjustments. Okay, so now that I feel as if I've brushed them both well enough, I'm going to remove my selected overlay, and that will allow me to see the type of adjustments that I'm going to be making. First things first, I didn't want to lift shadows by too much on a global level, so now at a specific level, only on the areas that I've adjusted, I'm going to be lifting these shadows even a little bit more. Once again, because they're backlit and we're using quite a lot of the detail in the foreground and on their faces. That will include some highlights, and it will also include upping some of the whites, some of the blacks, and perhaps even a touch of exposure. Although not a hell of a lot, you've got to be quite careful about doing this too much, but just enough where I'm comfortable that the shadows are lifted off of my subjects. Again, a little more. Then what I want to do is add some clarity, just to force a hardened edge between my subjects and the background, particularly when you're looking at the main area. And then of course some sharpness. Even though I've already done masking, I'm going to go and add some further sharpening to my subjects over and above that. And then I'm going to close down on that brush. So now, if we go and look at the before and after, on a specific level, we've now gone and brushed these areas, and look at the difference between the face previously and where it is now. We've recovered a lot of detail around this mane over here, especially around these areas at the bottom. That's really dark and you've lost a lot of that sharpness and clarity, whereas here you've been able to recover it. That stands out a lot more at the top in terms of the backlighting and rim lighting, and just generally a lot more detail and a lot more expression that you can now see in the face, which previously was shrouded in shadow. And the female much the same, quite a dark body as a result of being in the shadow, and now a little bit lighter and more prominent in the frame than she was previously. And the combination of both global adjustments on an incremental level across a lot of these drop downs and brushing specifically over my subjects has now got me to the point where this is the image that was captured in camera, granted with the correct settings first and foremost, because no amount of editing is going to correct the fact that you've got your aperture or your shutter speed wrong. So provided you've got everything right in camera and you've captured the image, there's a lot that you can do, although through smaller changes at a time, to make the image look like this. And if I go and show you the full screen, when it decides to load eventually, that is what we've got. And I'm quite happy spending 4 or 5 minutes on global and a couple extra minutes on specific adjustments to get the image looking like it is now, from where it was, and I'm quite happy with that adjustment. I'm not going to do anything more than that. I think anything more than that would be just kind of overstepping that mark of changing rather than enhancing the image, and you really can. I thought of perhaps even brushing the background and making it slightly darker, which would force even further separation between my subject and its background, but then I'm really starting to delve into the realm of changing the image rather than just enhancing what the eye had seen. And so I'm quite happy at this point that I would stop the edit and export and do whatever I need to do with that particular image. But that's basically it, guys. Like you've seen, it's not a hell of a lot. I didn't make any serious adjustments. I worked through the basic panel, watching both the histogram and the image whilst doing so. I knock 5 to 10% off the adjustments I make to whites and blacks in the basic panel and make up for that in the tone curve, and then go down and work on detail and cropping and things like that. And once I'm happy that I've affected the entire image on a global level, I can then go and look for specific adjustments that I'd already identified originally before even starting the editing process, and make those adjustments with the specialized or localized adjustment brush. And I've got to the point where I'm happy that the image is of the quality that my eye had captured the scene, and I wouldn't do a hell of a lot more than that. And that's basically it, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. There wasn't too much to this particular image other than the fact that it was an incredibly cool scene to witness. We'd kind of been there in the sighting and watched the whole thing unfold, from the lions waking up to some of the females walking off, the males chasing them, the fight ensued, and from there was a lot of animosity and aggression that existed between the lionesses and the males, which first and foremost was great to witness, but secondly provided some further photographic opportunities with which our guests were able to capture, and we thoroughly enjoyed the sighting. We were only vehicle there, which made it even better, and we spent a good 2 to 2.5 hours with these lions. In fact, at a later stage, which if you follow my Instagram feed, we'll be seeing shortly, one of these lionesses actually moved off and went to go and collect 3 of her cubs that she was keeping in one of the local marshlands in one of the floodplain areas of the Khwai region, and they came and joined the pride as well. So my instinct tells me that the reason why this fight happened between the male and the female was as a result of the fact that there were some cubs around, which was quite interesting. So, like I said, my first behind the frame, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I've taken you through how I would go and edit an image. What's really important to note, and for my purposes as well, is the more you're able to capture the image correctly in camera, the less time you have to spend editing afterwards. And a lot of people don't quite understand that. They put their cameras on auto, or even if they're not on auto, they shoot whatever they feel is necessary, and then spend a lot of time post-processing trying to get that image right. And if you haven't captured it right in camera, you're going to be spending a lot of time post-processing, and at the end of the day, if your shutter speed is too slow and your image is blurry, if your depth of field is off and only a portion of your image is sharp, there's really nothing that post-processing can do to fix that. So first and foremost, make sure you're getting the camera settings right in camera. Listen to your guide in terms of anticipating certain animal behavior. Be ready for the moment. Watch your frame. It was quite easy in this particular scene, especially those that are shooting with longer lenses, to cut tails off and feet off and heads off and things like that. Make sure you're studying your frame. Leave yourself enough space for that action to take place. And provided you've captured it all as best as you possibly can in camera, limit the amount of time that you will be spending on your image after the fact. So that's basically it. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to the next Behind the Frame series that I'll be running soon. Cheers, guys.